This is Tempest-Tossed, Conversations on Migration and Mobility, and I'm Alex Aleinikoff.
They had taken away the crayons and coloring books a couple of years ago, but they did have a blackboard and the children would sort of draw on the blackboard. And the one thing that they seemed to draw the most, they would be drawing sort of hearts.
The Trump administration's separation of immigrant children from their parents sparked outrage and lawsuits across the country. The public outcry led the president to issue an executive order abandoning the separation policy, but not the zero-tolerance policy that gave rise to it. Lawsuits led courts to order the government to reunite the families. Yet today, more than 500 children remain in detention, separated from their parents. And the Trump administration has stated that the parents of more than 400 of these children are no longer in the United States. That is, they have been deported without their kids. As disturbing as the separation policy has been, as damaging as it has been to young children, and as hurtful as it has been to their parents, reunification of families does not end the story. Because many of the parents of the children are deportable from the United States, families face wrenching decisions about whether to take their children home, to leave them here without the parents, or to stay with them in detention and continue to fight their asylum cases. Let me briefly review the immigration process here and what brought us to the current state of affairs. Families that sought to enter the United States were arrested by Border Patrol agents. The parents were held for criminal prosecution, and their children were quickly taken from them and put into detention in many different places around the United States. After being found guilty of the crime of illegal entry, the parents were then held for deportation from the United States in ICE detention facilities. Then a court ordered unification of the family, saying that the separation policy violated the constitutional rights of the family members. More than 2,000 children have now been reunited with their parents, but many reunited families have been placed in ICE detention facilities. Parents can seek to prevent their deportation by filing an asylum claim, but under a recent decision by Attorney General Jeff Sessions, most of these cases will be difficult to win. Our guest today is Professor Lauren Gilbert, a professor of law at the St. Thomas University School of Law. Professor Gilbert traveled with 12 of her students to the Karnes County Residential Center in Karnes, Texas, where immigrant families are currently being detained. She worked there with RICES, which is a nonprofit legal organization that remains on the front lines of these issues, working with immigrants and their families. Lauren, thanks so much for being with us today.
Thank you for inviting me.
Can you set the stage for us? Where is the Karnes County Residential Center, and when you got there, what did you find?
Okay, the Karnes County Residential Center is about 1 hour southeast of San Antonio, and it is in Karnes City, which is a very sort of rural community of about 3,500 individuals. And up until very recently, it had held women and children asylum seekers. But when I arrived with my team of 14 students, actually 12 students, we found that at this point, the center is being used to detain the recently reunified fathers and sons who had been separated upon their arrival at the border over the last couple of months since Jeff Sessions announced his zero tolerance policy.
Can you tell us a bit about what the conditions were like at Karnes? How many people were there, and how did they live?
So the week before we arrived, the fathers and sons had really just started to trickle in. These were the fathers and sons who had just been reunified. By about midweek before we arrived on Sunday was our first day. There were around 300 fathers and sons who had arrived. By the end of the week, that number was growing Carnes has a capacity for about 830 beds. I don't think it was up to capacity at that point. But when we were there, basically all of the people who were there, 100% of the families that we saw when we arrived were the reunified fathers and sons. So it was probably somewhere around 400, 500 people who were there.
And they were being permitted to live in the same quarters?
Yes, they were in the same quarters. They have these rooms that basically have bunk beds, and generally there are 2 families per room. They were together. They would separate the children during the day to go to classes. They had one classroom that basically served all of the kids from like 5 to 17.
Okay, so you've got about 300 to 500 immigrants at Carnes. These are recently reunited fathers and sons. And what are they waiting for there? What's the next step in the process?
Okay, so when we got there, it was pretty much right after the families had been reunified. And at that point, there was a lawsuit that was pending, and we had heard that the judge had issued an order that basically prevented the government from deporting people back to their countries. But there was a rumor that the judge was going to lift that order, which would allow the government to go forward with its plan of deporting people. So the first day we saw over 200 fathers and sons who were interested in fighting their cases, because many of these fathers and sons many of the fathers were already at the end of the road and had decided that they wanted to go back. And so part of what we were doing was talking to them and talking about what options they had to be able to stay and fight their cases. And so that first day, we basically talked to them and filled out hundreds of these forms for dads who said that they wanted to stay and fight their asylum cases.
Okay, so let's see if we understand. So these were fathers who had been separated, had been criminally prosecuted for illegal entry. They were now back in ICE custody and deportable for the country from the United States, but some of them, or many of them, would still be able to assert an asylum claim saying they feared persecution if returned to their country of origin. Is that right?
That's correct. So when they had attempted to come into the country, if they had entered illegally, they were separated from their children almost immediately. They oftentimes had no chance to say goodbye or a couple of minutes to say goodbye. They were then criminally prosecuted for illegal entry. And then after they were encouraged by their public defenders to plead guilty because it would be the fastest way that they could reunify with their kids, they were then moved to ICE detention facilities. They were still separated from their children at that point, and they had to make these awful choices. The government at first was telling them that they had 2 choices. They could either stay and fight their cases, in which case they would continue to be separated from their children, or they could agree to be deported, in which event they would be reunified with their children. And so faced with that choice, a lot of the fathers basically agreed to deportation so that they could see their kids again.
But you're saying at Carnes they had an opportunity then to bring back their asylum claim and try to fight deportation on that ground?
Well, that's what we were trying to do. So for dads who had basically given up, who had either decided not to fight their cases, or dads who had tried to fight their cases and had to have these interviews while they were separated and were completely traumatized, that what we did with them was we met with them, we explained what their options were. So fathers who had never had that initial interview, we were able to get them to fill out a form saying they were afraid to go back to their country and they wanted to fight their case. But then there were other cases where they had wanted to fight their case, but they had lost their interview. And we saw lots of cases where the dads were just traumatized during their interview. They talked about All they could think about was their children. They were generally in a room with an asylum officer, and the interpreter was on the phone, and the interpreter was telling them to stop when they would start basically expressing what had happened to them, and they would lose their train of thought. And so in a lot of cases, their interviews did not go well because of what they were experiencing as being separated from their kids. So in those cases, what we were trying to do was to get them a chance at a new interview, or to get them back before an immigration judge. So those are the harder cases.
And when you talk to some of the children with their parents and some alone, what condition did you find these children in?
Well, we saw kids from as little as 5 to as old as 17, and the little ones were, in most cases, were sort of manic. Is the only way I can describe it. They would oftentimes they would refuse to leave their father's side. We would try to get the kids to go over to the area to play so that we could talk to their dads about the experiences back in their home country. They would cry. It was hard to get them to talk at all. A lot of them just were, it was just very, one minute they would be happy and smiling and reading a book, and the next minute they would be sort of acting, becoming violent and hitting other children. And it was clear that they had really suffered during their time in separation. So the little kids, the little kids were sort of refusing to leave their father's sides. And it was really traumatic when they tried to take them away to take them to school, because they were afraid that they were being separated again. And then the older kids, it varied. I mean, some cases they were clearly really happy to be back with their fathers, but in other cases they seemed to be sort of angry with their fathers, and their fathers were asking, were constantly asking them to forgive them for what had happened. There was a huge amount of guilt that the fathers had experienced, but we were essentially meeting with them at the point where they were just getting to know each other again. And a lot of the fathers talked about how the little kids that they had been separated from were very different than the children with whom they've been reunited, that they were crying, that they were needy, that they were angry, that they were acting out, that these weren't the same kids that they had last seen. There's one case where one of my students was reading to one of the little children, and there was a book about where there was a hen and some chicks, and then there was an eagle that was sort of above, and the hen had its wing around the chick, and the little kid looked at the picture and said that hen is my daddy, and the chick is me. And so the children really saw their fathers as their protectors. They had taken away the crayons and reading and coloring books a couple of years ago, but they did have a blackboard, and the children would sort of draw on the blackboard. And the one thing that they seemed to draw the most, they would be drawing sort of hearts on the blackboard.
Okay, now, as I understand it, sometimes the desires and interests of the children were not exactly the same as the desires and the interests of the fathers. Can you describe where those interests may have differed?
Sure. I think the hardest thing we had to do while we were there was to determine whether there was a conflict between what the father wanted, particularly in cases where the father had just decided that he no longer wanted to fight his case and he just wanted to go home, and whether that interest was consistent with what was in the best interest of the children. So one of the things they asked us to do was to meet with a number of the children to determine what they wanted to do, whether they wanted to stay with their fathers who had asked to be deported, or whether they wanted to stay in this country. And so we talked to kids from age 5 to age 17, and it was kind of ridiculous to ask a 5-year-old what he wanted to do and whether he wanted to be with his father. And some of these kids were barely verbal. I mean, it was hard to even get them to tell you their name or how old they were. But I think what we saw was that, most of the children that we saw clearly wanted to be with their fathers. But it wasn't always clear if that was necessarily in the best interest of the children. I mean, some of the children looked well adjusted and happy to be reunited, but other kids you could tell had really suffered during their time in separation and had this sort of kind of look of neglect in their eyes. But it was hard. We couldn't make that kind of determination on our own. But then with the older kids, it was different, because I think with the older kids, once you get into the 15, 16, 17-year-old range, their interests do diverge. And there were a couple of different cases. There was one case where the father did want to go back and he wanted the son to go with him, but where the son wanted to stay in the United States. And he told us that. But he was really concerned because he knew that if he decided to stay and fight his case, which he could as an unaccompanied minor, that his dad would likely be sent to one of these horrible detention centers.
So I'm hearing three options here then. The father can say he wants to go back and wants his child with him, and the child may agree, in which case ICE will deport both. The father may decide to go back, but the child might say, I prefer to stay in the United States, and the father will be deported, but the child will probably be released from detention with some other kind of sponsorship in the United States. And the third is that the father could fight deportation by filing his asylum claim, in which case he would probably remain at Carnes with his child or in some other family detention situation. Are those the three options?
I think the first two options are right. The third option is a little bit more complicated but basically it means that if dad wants to fight his case, then he would have to stay in detention with his child while he continues to do so. But it doesn't necessarily mean that he gets an asylum case before an immigration judge, because in many cases, a lot of these dads already have final orders where they've been ordered deported, and now they're trying to basically get those cases reopened so that they can keep fighting their cases. And that's really hard.
You said earlier that many of these fathers, upon being criminally convicted and separated from their kids, were quite traumatized and therefore either didn't request asylum or had a cursory kind of hearing where they really were not able to present their case. They're now facing orders of removal from the United States. Now that they've been at Carnes and spoken with lawyers, are there more fathers who are willing to try to stay in the country and continue their quest for asylum?
That seems to be what's happening, that some of the fathers who got new interviews and passed those interviews are being let out with ankle monitors. They're being released from detention. And as fathers see that beginning to happen, more and more fathers are willing to stay and fight their cases. And, part of that's been possible because at this point, everything is on hold and no one is being deported, but at any moment that could change. So in a lot of those cases, it's really, sort of slowing the process down to give fathers and sons a chance to reconnect, because in a lot of cases, those bonds have been broken, and that we're finding that with time, the time heals all wounds, and that dads and kids are willing to kind of stick it out together. But it means that if they decide to do that, then the child's going to remain in detention while that process takes place.
And of course, there's no guarantee they'll be granted asylum or some other form of relief. And in fact, Attorney General Sessions has issued new guidance in asylum cases recently that makes it much harder for many of these cases to succeed. He says that most people whose cases are based on claims that they'd be persecuted by gangs, which are what many of the cases are based on, will have a very hard time succeeding in the U.S. asylum system. Is that right?
Yes, I mean that's what's happening. I mean there are lots of lawsuits that are challenging that, but Jeff Sessions' decision in that one case, and then the guidelines that were recently issued by the asylum unit, pretty much tell asylum officers that if it's a gang-based claim or a gender-based asylum claim, that it should generally not qualify for asylum. So a lot of people are not even getting through that initial stage of the process because of the Sessions decision and because of the asylum office guidelines.
As you saw the dads and the kids and the possible claims the dads could raise for staying in the country, did it seem that some of them had claims that would have been recognized before the Sessions decision came out, but now were in peril of being recognized?
Absolutely. There were a number of claims that we saw that were essentially they had been told that they didn't have a case by the government. But the more we talked with them, they were definitely cases that would have made it through the credible fear process prior to the decision in the Jeff Sessions decision. And in fact, there were several cases where Raices ended up doing a request for a new interview with the asylum office, and where they said that in the two of those cases were pretty strong and should have made it through the credible fear process, and the fourth case was extremely strong. And in all four of those cases, the decision came back no from the local asylum office.
So if we can put this all together, we have a situation where the fathers and the kids entered the country. The father was arrested and criminally prosecuted and ordered deported. And even if he had an asylum claim that might have gained him legal residence in the United States several months ago, now with the new Sessions order, it's unlikely to succeed. So these dads are really likely to be out of avenues for staying in the United States. And that's what makes so acute this question of what happens with the child. Is that a fair summary of what you've said?
I think that that's a fair summary. There were definitely cases where we saw where dad had what we would consider to be a very viable asylum claim that was connected to gang violence, but where there was a good argument that he would qualify under the asylum definition, but where he was, desperate to return to the rest of his family, but he also wanted what was best for his son as well. And so those were cases where dads were essentially being faced with this choice of letting their child stay and going back so that their child would be able to get out of detention. And we saw that with kids as old as 17 and as young as 5, where the father had clearly fled the country because the father was afraid of what would happen to the child. So there definitely were cases where the child would have a viable asylum claim under existing precedent, but where the father would not.
Well, really, you're painting a really a difficult picture for these families, which many people thought the problem had been solved with a court order ordering the families to be reunified. But it seems it has just put them in the midst of a set of very difficult choices.
I think that's true. And I think part of the problem is that you have the court order that ordered family reunification, but that the order was so narrowly defined that it didn't deal with what would happen once reunification occurred. And so there are all of these other lawsuits that are going on around the country in New York, where the Legal Aid Society is trying to protect the rights of the children as unaccompanied children. In DC, where they are trying to protect the rights of the parents and kids so that the kids can stay and fight their cases, and the dads and moms can stay with the kids while they fight their cases, since their cases really turn on what happened to the parents. And right now, sort of all of these cases are being. It seems like all of these cases are being transferred to the judge who has the case, ordering family reunification to try to sort all of this out. But unless that can be done, unless they can come up with a remedy or a plan that would allow parents to stay and fight their cases, or at least to stay and help their kids fight their cases, that we may end up in a situation where the parents have to give up and go back to their country so that their child can stay, or alternatively take their kids back to them, to situations where the kids will face horrific conditions.
Lauren, thanks so much for being with us today. And I imagine this was quite an experience for the students you took down to Carnes to see this as well. And thanks for telling us about the excellent work that RISIS is doing at Carnes to try to figure out these really terrifically difficult questions. Thanks so much. After we recorded the conversation with Professor Gilbert, a federal court issued an order temporarily barring the government from deporting reunited families. This order covers the families at Carnes. The court will hear full arguments soon on whether the parents and their children should now be given an opportunity to pursue their claims for asylum. Stay tuned. You have been listening to Tempest Tossed, a production of the Zolberg Institute on Migration and Mobility at the New School. Technical assistance is provided by Sohail Ansari at Dodge 112. Our themes were composed by Eli Aleinikoff. We would welcome your comments and suggestions for future episodes. You can reach us at tossedtempest@gmail.com. That is tossedtempest, all one word, @gmail.com.